How y'all doing today? Excellent. Well, NATO is the most successful alliance in history, and it's the most enduring, which continues to thrive despite a litany of proclamations of NATO's imminent demise. And this is ironic to me because all the other countless alliances we've had in history have crumbled, and but hardly a word has ever been spoken about their imminent demise, and no one ever worried about it. But everyone was always constantly worried about imminent crumbling or NATO crumbling. So why has NATO endured? And this is the central question of this lecture. But it'll also help explain NATO's future, where it's going to go from here. So in order to understand NATO, we really have to understand its origins. So I'm not going to go back to 500 BC, but I will go back to the Yalta Conference, which took place in February 1945. Of course, you had the big three. You had Churchill, you had Stalin, and you had FDR. And basically what they wanted to accomplish at the conference was the occupation zones of Germany, because you have all these armies coming together, and you don't want them to clash. So you had to have lines of demarcation. Also, we needed demarcation lines among the occupying powers as they were liberating Europe. Some of the things that they wanted to reestablish were the European governments after the war, all except for Vichy France. That's the only government that was not reestablished. And they had to reshape Poland. If you look at Poland right over here, the eastern territories were taken from Poland by the Soviet Union, and they took this portion of Germany and this portion of Germany and gave it to Poland as compensation. The Poles were not happy with that, by the way. Also, you had the Soviet promise of independence. Stalin gave his promise to FDR that he would recognize Poland and its independence, and he'd have elections soon after the war. And in exchange for that, the Soviets would join the war against Japan, and we would have a new creation. It was called the United Nations. And FDR, at the very end of the conference, promised Stalin that he was going to withdraw from Europe within 2 years after the victory against Germany. So, that following July and August, we have the Potsdam Conference, which was located near Berlin at the time. We only have one leader that's still part of the big three. That's Stalin. Churchill's been voted out of power, and FDR has died in March of 45. Was it March or April? April. Okay, thank you. So you have two newbies, basically, there going against Stalin, and Stalin is an old hat. He's been in power for about 2 decades. So Stalin knows what he wants. The other two aren't quite sure. I think the other one was Clement Attlee, was the British Prime Minister. So what was the Potsdam Conference about? Well, it's really the formalization of the Yalta Agreements and also the innovation of Germany. No one wants to see Germany come back as a major military power again. So the whole idea was, how do we keep them down? So they're there to discuss that. But there's some problems that erupt during the conference. Number one is Poland's independence is betrayed by Stalin. He has no intent to give them independence. There's not going to be any elections there, and that comes out. Also, there's the formation of the Eastern Bloc with communist governments, Soviet-imposed communist governments in these countries. So thereafter, we have a number of conferences that occur from 1945 to 1947. You have London, Paris, Moscow, New York. And in the midst of all these conferences, it becomes apparent to the allies, the Western allies, that the political issues that they want to settle after World War II, including the peace treaties, former Italian colonies, the status of Germany, are we going to have it unified? Is it going to be partitioned? Are we going to annex the Ruhr and the Saarland? Those are the industrial areas of Germany. Those are not going to be resolved. And in fact, the Soviet Union is becoming more and more recalcitrant. The, the World War II alliance is dead. And it occurs to George Marshall, who was the Chief of Staff of the Army and then later Secretary of State, that it's really the Soviets that are not interested in peace. So the Cold War has really begun at this point, but it's really slow in forming battle lines. Now, the United States decided not to pull out its remaining military forces as a result of this recalcitrance of the Soviets. Truman does not trust Stalin, so he's not going to pull out the military forces. Well, what's in Germany right now? All the U.S. divisions have pulled out, the 90 or so divisions of the Allies. So in its place are the U.S. Constabulary Forces, and their headquarters is activated in Bamberg. If you've ever been to Bamberg, nice place. It's actually where Wagner and his family live, so they could go to operas there as well. And the Constabulary Force really remained in place from '46 until the early 1950s. And that consisted of the 1st Infantry Division, a separate infantry brigade, and about 10 cavalry regiments. And if you ever had a chance to see the old constabulary patch, you would be looking back into some history there. That's pretty much forgotten. There we go. All right. Now, the Allies did an estimate of the Soviet threat in 1945. And they determined accurately that the Soviet Union was not interested in military aggression against Europe. That may come to a surprise to a lot of you because we were inculcated during the Cold War that the Soviets were a major military threat. Well, from 1945 to 1950, that was not the case. The Soviet strategy was to keep Europe in upheaval, which in the ensuing chaos would pave the way for communist takeovers. The methods employed were subversion of weak democratic governments, that is, obstructing economic recovery and political stability, especially in Germany, and fomenting civil unrest through surrogates. That's strikes, riots, protests, things like that. Now, two principal countries that are being attacked in this way are Italy and France. Italy and France come this close to becoming communist states, but they don't because of the actions that we take. Now, ordinarily, subversion is not very effective against a well-established state, even a democracy. But the problem in Europe is it's been devastated by World War II. The cities are in rubble, the industries and infrastructures are in ruins, the economies have completely collapsed, and people are on the brink of famine. Europeans were so demoralized by the hardships of World War II and its aftermath that they were looking for anything to save them. So they're in search of a new ideology. And what ideology is attractive to them? Well, Soviet socialism. As hard as it is for us to believe that, it was very attractive at the time. And Soviet socialism has some persuasive advantages for the European states. Number one, the Soviet Union bore the brunt of the land war in World War II. Everyone recognized that. Communist resistance groups throughout Europe had fought the Germans, and so they were well respected in that. From Greece to France to Italy, you had communist groups that were combating the Germans. Also, the Soviet command economy appeared more viable for the Europeans. It had small unemployment. Pre-war European democracies, on the other hand, were pretty unstable, particularly in Germany. They were vulnerable to internal threats, and as a result, you had years and years of destabilization. Capitalism, on the other hand, suffered from recessions, depressions, and high unemployment. The Great Depression in the United States was well known in Europe because they suffered through it as well. So capitalism and democracy did not look to be very viable models for them. But some of that is really just perceptions, because actually economic recovery after VE Day was progressing pretty rapidly. Factories were rebuilt, and they are equipped with American goods. The skilled labor force and educated classes were still intact, and productions reached pre-war levels. But then the harsh winter of 1946, 1947 stopped that. You had a shutdown in transportation and commerce. This led to dramatic economic deterioration. And the following summer, you had a massive drought, which resulted in low crop yields. So without a resumption of the flow of goods and services, the recession that they were experiencing could easily slip into a depression. As a result, a fear arose that the European countries would slip into disorder, just as the Soviets had wanted, and decay, and then vote in communist leaders out of desperation, or join the Soviet camp out of admiration, or just to say to hell with it, we're capitulating to the Soviet intimidation and threats. So what was the U.S. reaction to that? Well, a little-known foreign service officer in the Moscow embassy, U.S. embassy in Moscow, by the name of George Kennan, wrote a long telegram to the Department of State. It's also summarized in the X article, 1947 edition of Foreign Affairs. And it really outlines Russian foreign policy behavior. Why are the Soviets acting in such a way? And he says, they're no different than the czars. They act the same way as the czars did. And so what he says as a strategy, as a solution is, we need to do a thing called containment. And really containment was a long-term patient but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. And it's going to take a long time. He had no end date on that. The intent, or his expectation, was that after a period of time, the Soviet system would collapse from its own internal contradictions. So really what we're looking at is not a rollback of the Soviet Union, but to hold the status quo until they collapse on their own. Now we have some other events that occur in that time period. Britain, who has suffered from the war, they're losing their empire, they're decolonizing, informed the United States that they can no longer pay for the struggles that are going on in Turkey and Greece. And so as a result, Truman makes a speech on 12 March 1947, and he pledges $400 million in aid to Greece and Turkey. Actually, he's not pledging, he's asking Congress whether he can get that money for that, because Congress is not going to release that money very easily. And basically what he says is the policy of the United States is to support free people who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. Truman is now getting the United States involved in European affairs, and that rubs a lot of Americans the wrong way. Marshall, who has come out of all these conferences, also recognizes the plight that Europe is going through. And so he recommends a thing called the European Recovery Program. We know that today as the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan lasts from about June 1947 to 1951. And it was intended to rebuild the economies and spirits of Western Europe. You all know that. I know that. Marshall was convinced that the key to restoration of political stability lay in the revitalization of national economies. The two are linked. And so how much does he ask for? He only asked for $13 billion. By today's standards, that's pretty darn cheap. And it results in the rejuvenation of European industrialization. It increased corporate investments, it stimulated the U.S. economy, and it increased trade between North America and Europe. Now, Marshall's ultimate goal for this little program was the economic integration and political unification of Europe. Now, that's utopian, really. From back then, that's really utopian. But that's those are the seeds that he's planting with the Marshall Plan. Now, The ulterior motive for the United States was, once the Europeans recovered economically, the Europeans would regain their self-confidence. They would then focus on rebuilding their military strength, and they would feel secure even in the presence of the Soviet military. So they wouldn't need the United States to back them up. Therefore, the United States would be able to withdraw their military forces. But it became apparent that the Marshall Plan was not going to be enough. The communists were becoming much more activist and confrontational. I already mentioned the Greek Civil War. You had the Czech communist coup d'etat in 1948. You had the Berlin blockade in June of 48 to May 49. And you had the Soviet atomic test in August of 1949. So they caught up real fast. We thought that we would have at least 10 years before they would acquire the atomic bomb. They didn't. Through espionage, they were able to beat that. Does anyone know how many atomic bombs we had at that time? We had 200. So, which seems like a lot. But with the military planners advising the president, they said, it's not going to win a war. And, oh, by the way, we have wind of a new type of weapon called the thermonuclear war. It's a fusion bomb. And Truman was not very enthusiastic about the thermonuclear bomb, but if the Soviets were working on it, then we needed to have it, even if we weren't going to use it. It's better that we had it and not use it than not have it and have the Soviets use it. So that's why he goes for the research on that. Another alarming development, which is really a surprise to everyone, including Stalin, was the communist takeover of China in 1949. That was really disheartening for a lot of democratic states. Now, the good news is that the USSR, that the Soviet Union, was not like the Third Reich. Remember, they had no intention of military aggression. Nazi Germany did from the very beginning. So the assessment was the Soviets were going to push their agenda to the brink of war, but they would not cross that threshold. They would scoop up anything that would fall onto the ground, any states and such. But they would back off if they were challenged by the United States. So this firm but patient strategy was one that was first adopted by Truman. Now, the Truman administration also realized that although war was not sought, it could occur by miscalculation or accident. So the containment strategy was really designed to demonstrate a firm resolve against Soviet encroachments. You all with me still, right? We haven't even started with NATO yet. All right, so NATO. The creation of NATO was really part of a measured response to the Soviet threat. And it really, I think it really gels in the mind of the Truman administration as a result of the Berlin blockade. And the Berlin blockade was a result of Britain and the United States wanted to have a unified currency for Germany in order to beat the recession. They wanted to have that German recovery for the economy. The Soviets didn't want that. They wanted the recession to continue so they could create civil unrest. So when the Allies created a zone called Bizonia, it's an odd name, for this new currency, and the French joined it a little bit later. Why they didn't call it Trizonia is beyond me. Maybe it was too close to the tricolors of the French Republic. Stalin decided, oh, okay, I'll show you. I'm going to block off all access to Berlin. And he does. So what Truman does is he institutes the Berlin blockade, or the airlift. That's kind of immaterial, because what's really material are the strategic effects of that, and it's totally different than what Stalin had expected. Because the Berlin airlift undercuts the American isolationist arguments against an entangling alliance in Europe. As you recall, if you're an American, you know that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson had warned against entangling alliances with the Europeans. Stay out of their affairs. You can fight wars there and have wartime coalitions and alliances, but as soon as it's over with, you get out and let the Europeans go back to their business. Now we're changing something. This is really a revolution in American foreign policy. As a result of this, the Senate that was looking at the Marshall Plan signed it into law immediately. They also began talks on NATO. And without that, NATO, these talks probably would not have occurred, at least seriously. Now, before talking about NATO, there was a little thing the Europeans were doing, and it was called the Brussels Treaty, March 1948. It was a collective defense agreement among Britain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Little small thing, little collective defense. And what it's telling the United States is, hey, we're not going to depend on you totally. We're trying to also institute collective defense, and if you kind of want to join us in this, we'd really welcome it. The United States kind of considered this, and even though they had apprehensions about this entangling alliance, so they started negotiations with the Europeans on it. What did the United States want out of this thing? Well, they wanted to provide a nuclear umbrella for the Europeans, backed by naval and air power as a security guarantee. It wasn't NATO in our minds yet. It was still called NAT, the North Atlantic Treaty. No organization was going to come of this. So while we were committed to NAT, the Europeans, they didn't like that. What they really wanted was the American guarantee to have more teeth to it. So they wanted the Americans to also contribute ground forces. Right now, we just wanted the Europeans to do the ground forces. We already had the air power, the nuclear, the naval, so our contribution was already there. They would actually have to rebuild their ground forces. And if we forced them to build ground forces, then we wouldn't have to do it. But they didn't feel too good about that, because ground forces are expensive, let's face it. What the Europeans wanted was an automatic U.S. intervention if the Soviets attacked. Not a good idea with us, because number one, it's unconstitutional. You cannot commit the United States to an automatic war without Congress becoming involved. So that's not going to happen. And really, the United States was still of the tendency to withdraw its ground forces, the ground forces we already had in place. And it's not a concern that a larger U.S. commitment in Europe would encourage the Europeans to do less. So if you don't have the ground forces involved and you pull them out, then the Europeans will have to fend for themselves. That's really what we're looking at. Now, there's a little-known chapter called Chapter 5 in the NATO Treaty, and that's basically an armed attack on one member is an armed attack on all the rest of the members. But the United States slipped into this little clause, a thing called yes, we will come to the assistance of a party or parties so attacked, but such action as it deems necessary, including the use of force, meaning we reserve the right to respond with force or not. It's a big clause, and it's still used a great deal, sometimes against us now. By the way, what's Algeria doing in here? Why are they part of NATO? Yeah, well, Algeria was part of France at the time. In fact, it had been part of France since 1830. So it's not until you have the French-Algerian War in 1954 to 1962 that Algeria becomes an independent country. And oh, by the way, all these countries here are experiencing decolonization during these first 20 years of NATO. Britain, France, Portugal, a lot of African nations. And so an attack on a colony, the implications are, particularly if you're France, that the United States should come to your assistance. So Dien Bien Phu in Indochina in 1954 becomes a major issue in a crisis between the United States and France, because France says, hey, we're part of NATO, you should help us out here in Dien Bien Phu. It doesn't work, but it is a consideration that they try to use. Now, We don't call NATO NATO at the time. We call it the Washington Treaty. That's our side of it. So what's the Washington Treaty do? Well, it really is NATO, and it's ratified on 4 April 1949 and had 12 members. So it's the United States, Canada, Belgium, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, and the United Kingdom, and all their possessions. So if you look back, you see Greenland here, which is part of Denmark at the time. And Iceland, well, what does Iceland have that we want? I mean, they don't have an army. So what do we need them for? Yeah, air bases, and Iceland figured prominently during the War of the Atlantic and World War II with all those U-boats running around. And so all these bases here were useful in case the Soviets decided that they might want to project out into the North Atlantic. Now, little known fact, Iceland is the only country that was neutral in World War II that was invaded by the Allies. Britain invades Iceland. They don't forget it. They're not very happy when we ask them to join NATO. And so it takes a lot of negotiations with them, like, we're sorry, we didn't mean it, we needed you, we really need your help now, would you please come? And they go, yes, okay. Of course, you get a lot of money involved in that too, particularly with those bases. Also, the Federal Republic of Germany is announced in April 1949. Now you have a West Germany. I'll go back to this slide. Now, East Germany is not recognized. We recognize West Germany, but East Germany, not yet. We're not ready to recognize that, which doesn't please the Soviets very, very much. And so East Germany really isn't recognized until 1973 as a result of détente and things like that. Another little thing that the United States is trying to do is it's trying to help the Europeans help themselves, self-help thing. So they have a thing called Mutual Defense Assistance Program. It's a little thing. It's ratified in October 1949 and appropriates about $1.4 billion for the purpose of building Western European defenses. And so a lot of that money is going into building bases to help the Europeans acquire equipment, American equipment, so they can start on the business of rebuilding themselves. They don't have to depend on us. And so together with the Marshall Plan, it's not a crash program. It's really a measured collective approach relying on European initiative. So we're trying to kickstart them. We're trying to get them in a good frame of mind. Now, why is that? Why are the Europeans so hesitant to focus on their own building of their own economies? It's that big bear that's looming over their shoulder. It's that Soviet intimidation of Western Europe, and it gets into their heads. They are now psychologically intimidated by the Soviets. The United States understands correctly that economic stagnation and not war is the primary danger to Europe. So stop focusing on the danger and start focusing on rebuilding your economies. Now, let's be a little honest. The United States is providing a security guarantee to Europe, nuclear weapons and stuff like that. But it doesn't really believe it's going to have to use them because the Soviets really aren't interested in military aggression. So if you promise you're going to protect them from military aggression, you know deep down that you're not going to have to, that card is never going to be called on you. So it's kind of easy from our point of view to promise those things. And so for the issue for Europe's recovery is really political, psychological. That's the real problem. And it's not anything to do with military readiness. But then something happens. And that something is the Korean War. The Korean War changes the whole calculus of the American strategy and NATO strategy. And it looked like, as a result of Korea starts on 25 June 1950 with the invasion of South Korea by the North Korean forces under the support of both the Soviets and the Chinese, who were both involved in that. But it looked like the Soviets were adopting a policy of military aggression now. Whoa. Now, all these promises that we had given to Europe, we might have to cash in. Because if it looks like the Soviets were getting ready to prepare for war, then the invasion of Europe is now a possibility. Now, this is not outlandish. If we look back at 10 years prior, you have the Germans doing the same thing. And so people are very aware of the approaching storm. And even though in hindsight it didn't occur, people don't have that advantage back then. So it doesn't look good. So the North Atlantic Council, which is really your supreme headquarters, other than shape, of NATO, has a conference, and so they endorse a thing called forward defense. Forward defense in Europe, meaning we're going to put divisions in Europe. And the North Atlantic Council had urged all its members to start increasing their military strength. Yeah, forget about economic recovery now. We want you to start focusing on rebuilding your militaries. And we want you to do it quickly. So in 1949, we had 12 divisions in Germany. 1950, only up 2. Not a whole lot. So the buildup was a little slow. Korea hits, all of a sudden, by mid-1951, we have 15 divisions and 1,000 aircraft. Now, from the U.S. side, we contributed 4 more divisions. Total of 6 divisions now in Europe. General Eisenhower is called out of retirement, and he is made the first Supreme Allied Commander. His main purpose is to organize the alliance efforts and the resources with the headquarters in Paris, SHAPE. And that was instituted in 1951. General Eisenhower is an organizational genius. If you've ever read his history, you would be impressed by the depth of his knowledge and experience on how to organize alliances. And so that's why he's sent to Europe to do such that. Plus, he knew all the foreign ministers there. He knew everyone. I mean, just left the job 5 years before. And so who else to garner the trust than Dwight Eisenhower? Along with this buildup, you have a buildup of infrastructure, airfields and headquarters. And that's quite important when you're building an alliance. So this is not a skinflint type of affair. This was a concerted effort to defend Europe. Now, NAT is no longer NAT, it is NATO. It is a true political military organization with integrated military forces under a unified international military commands, which would supervise the training and equipping of forces in peacetime. That's unheard of in history. Never have we had an alliance that had unified, integrated commands in peacetime. We also had some discussions on rearming Germany. Yeah, I'm not quite sure we want Germany to be remilitarized quite yet. You know, we still kind of remember them marching into Poland and France and elsewhere. So, and who's the primary adversary to that idea? Well, one of the first victims. So France is not very keen on remilitarizing Germany. It's going to have to wait. Some things are going to have to occur before that is going to be accepted. Now we also have another meeting in Lisbon by the North Atlantic Council in February 1952, and they say, okay, we need to have 25 full-strength divisions with 25 reserve divisions, 4,000 aircraft backed by strong naval forces by the end of 1952. Wow, that's only 8 months to do that. That's a fast buildup from 15 to 25. And oh, by the way, we also have a provisional goal to build it up even further. 35 to 40 full-strength divisions with 56 reserve divisions with a mobilization date of D plus 30 days by the end of 1954. So in a matter of 2 years, you're going to go from 15 divisions up to 45 divisions, or 40 divisions, and 56 reserve divisions. That's a lot of money. And that's also going to detract from your economic recovery. Europeans aren't very keen to do that. Why? Well, unlike us, the Korean War, for us, had spurred some initial readiness, but after a while, the European fears dissipated, and so that sense of urgency for rearmament had ebbed, and you even had some retrenchment as a result by 1953. And it's not really a guns versus butter issue. The West was really gripped by an inferiority complex in that Western armies would always be inadequate because democracies can never compete militarily with dictatorships. Hence, let's just have nuclear weapons, all right? We can't compete with the Soviet dictatorship. Let's not have large armies. It's hopeless. Just depend on nuclear weapons. So as a result, the Lisbon goals went unfulfilled. So by the end of 1953, you had 25 active divisions, 40 to 50 reserve divisions, and 3,000 aircraft. That's not counting the divisions in Turkey and Greece because they're peripheral states. Now, for the United States, we're still haunted by the Korean War. We see the world differently now. It's a much more dangerous place. And we're spurring our allies to do more. And the allies don't want to do it. I might add that the Korean War is not the only thing that's causing this obsession with us, because we're starting to connect dots. And some of those dots are the Soviet atomic bomb, of course. We know they're working on the thermonuclear war. There's the Soviet-Chinese pact, the monolithic communism that have been signed. Very scary to us. And by the way, we're fighting the Chinese in Korea. You have a lot of political and military hawks in the U.S. administrations or in the government that have assessed that the Soviet Union is eclipsing the United States militarily, economically, and industrially. This is going to be a common theme throughout the 50s. We cannot compete with them because they're so much better at these things than we are. You also have a little-known document called NSC 68. It's written by Paul Nitze in April 1949, and it's calling for a massive U.S. rearmament effort. Now when I say rearmament, I'm talking on a World War II scale. I'm talking about a mobilization of the United States democracy or arsenal of democracy to fight the imminent Soviet invasion of Europe or an attack on the United States. All these things together contribute to the psychosis that we go through. The Europeans aren't buying it. Yeah, you Americans, you guys always over obsess on stuff. But what they do like is collective defense. Whoa, collective defense. Why is that so attractive to European liberal democracies? Well, it leads to greater efficiencies. You're sharing everything. You have fewer redundancies, so not everyone has to build tanks and aircraft and things like that, so it's going to be fewer costs. Well, if you're spending less money on defense, what are you going to do with it? You're going to use that money for domestic programs, because the fastest way to get voted out of government is to start putting a lot of money towards military expenditures. As a lot of countries in Europe have learned in the early 50s, a lot of governments get voted out of power because of military expenditures. Now remember, I told you that the United States is continuing to pressure the European allies to do more. And the European allies are saying we are doing more. But we have no way of proving that they actually are doing more. So we institute a thing called the NATO Annual Review. And the NATO Annual Review is brilliant in a lot of ways, but it's unintended by our part. We just thought, we're just going to make sure that everyone kind of tells us what they're building. So it's really intrusive in a very positive sense. It leads to complete transparency among the Allied military forces at sharing information on the size and quality of the force, their weapons and equipment, their future plans, and their defense budgets. Everyone knows what everyone is building within the alliance now. This is unheard of in history, by the way. Now, the United States thinks, okay, now that we know what everyone's building, we'll be able to put more pressure on them to build more, because everyone has to pull their weight, right? Well, Europeans have a lot of time in their hands, and they're pretty smart people. So what they do, individually, they don't even come together on this. Individually, I guess it's part of state behavior, they say, hey, we're doing everything we can. We're meeting our goals for you. Those other members, they're not pulling their weight. And you got to put more pressure on them. So that's really the game that's being played. It's called burden shifting. And it's really fascinating. Now, while all this is going on, and NATO is in place, you have a couple of things that are going on within Europe itself that's going to have some long-term consequences, benefits, actually. You have the European defense community. It doesn't go anywhere. It's really the military, the European military pillar to what the United States was establishing. And the European defense community was a French concept. And they thought it was a great idea. You'd have like your own European force. But then they withdrew their own initiative because they had concerns over sovereignty. The French always have concerns over sovereignty. If something's going to take away their ability to have independence, they're not going to buy into it. And I think what they did was when they first came up with it, it seemed like a great way to kind of keep Germany under wraps. But when they really thought about it, they didn't like the idea, so they withdrew from it. And it was kind of a disappointment for the United States because they said, finally we have something to get the Europeans more involved in security matters, and it kind of died out. You also have a thing called the European coal and steel community, also an idea of the French and the Germans. And basically what it was the French are not altruistic, of course, because they're thinking about their own self-interest. They're deadly afraid that Germany is going to be able to remilitarize, particularly the industrialized area. So they say, look, if we share the coal and steel industrial basin with you, then we'll be able to have you recover faster, we'll be able to help you, and we'll be able to share this idea. The Germans said, that's a pretty good idea. So it becomes the Treaty of Paris in 1951, and it becomes Europe's first supranational community. It has France, Germany, Italy, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg as part of it. Now this becomes the European community in 1957, and eventually becomes the European Union in 1993. So the next time your grandchildren ask you, hey, where did the EU come from? You can say, well, European coal and steel community, of course. All right, now let's get to NATO dispositions, something that everyone likes to look at. Both sides are really the same. They just show the division line of our allies in Germany itself. And unless you're really interested, I'm not going to talk about the individual state contributions to it. During Q&A, we can do it if you want to do that. But we'll go on to the period that I call the period of strategies, dialogue, and treaties. And that lasts from 1953 to 1980. The first strategy is the Eisenhower massive retaliation strategy. Massive retaliation is solely concerned with Europe. It does not go outside of it. Even though Eisenhower never says that it's only going to be European specific, inside his inner circle, that's what it was for. And massive retaliation is a message to the Soviets. If you try anything, if you try any military adventurism in Europe, we will drop the bomb on you. And we're not even going to ask you. We're just going to do it automatically. Eisenhower wants to ensure that the Soviets make no misstep, that they don't miscalculate our resolve or opportunities that arise. that it was really an automatic trigger for a thermonuclear war against the Soviet Union. Now, Eisenhower's bluffing. He's an expert in poker and bridge. And so he never tells anyone if he's going to use the bomb or not. He doesn't give authorization to commanders to use the bomb. It's only in his hands. Only he has the button. And he never tells anyone under what circumstances he's going to use it. That keeps the Soviets guessing. Unfortunately, it keeps the Europeans guessing too. I'm not quite sure whether he's going to use it or not. Now, massive retaliation only applied to Europe. Outside of Europe, Eisenhower said, I'll play it as it goes. So you never see him attempting to use massive retaliation for the crises in Taiwan or the Suez crisis in '56 or Lebanon or elsewhere. Now along comes Kennedy with flexible response. Flexible response is the brainchild of Maxwell Taylor, who was chief of staff of the Army under Eisenhower. He didn't like the fact that the Army had downsized to such a degree, went from 1.5 million to 880,000. God, I wish those days were back. He didn't like that. And so he says, it's a result of massive retaliation. And what we really need is a flexible response to this stuff. Now, if you're really into reading the basic national security policies of Eisenhower, which I don't recommend unless you really are having trouble sleeping, these strategies actually had flexible response built into them if you read the text of these things. So what Maxwell Taylor does is kind of clever, is he says, I've got this new thing called flexible response, and even though these are secret documents, I can write about it in a book, and the Eisenhower administration can't refute them because that would be a security violation. And so he comes up with this idea that, all right, let's not depend on this nuclear retaliation because I don't think it's effective. Let's use conventional forces for little brush fire wars in Europe if they ever occur. I mean, that makes sense logically. Why go to nuclear war when you can just fight these things with small conventional forces? Well, there's a problem with that. It undermines the foundation of nuclear deterrence. And the people that depend on that are the Europeans. And so they're not too keen on someone coming up and saying, we'll fight little small wars in Europe. Because small wars have a tendency to become big wars. And they're unpredictable. And the Europeans certainly know that. They have a history of small wars becoming major conflicts. So as a result of flexible response, you have the likelihood of a war starting through a Soviet miscalculation. And the Europeans don't buy into it. They reject flexible response. No matter all the platitudes they give the United States at the time, they don't accept it. So in this time period, in the 70s, under Nixon, under Ford, under Carter, we have a thing called détente, or Ostpolitik if you're German. And it's really just, we want to relax the tensions between the East and West. And so you have a number of arms control negotiations, and it really becomes the modus vivendi between East and West as a result of that time period. You have the 1973 Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. It's also known as CSCE. That's also reducing tensions through dialogue. Let's talk about human rights, and let's talk about economic cooperation with the Soviets. Now, this is more European-based than American-based. Well, we're not so sure that we want to get all cozy with the Soviets. We're not so sure we want to have these dialogues, unless it's for arms control. We'll go into that, but we don't want to get too cozy with them. So you have a number of treaties. I won't get into them. They're all nuclear-based treaties, nuclear disarmament. But that all gets ruined. What ruins détente? It's the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, December 1979, and the Soviets knew it. They knew if they were going to go into it, it was going to destroy détente, and so they were gambling, and the gamble lost. Now, before we get into that, we should talk a little bit about the Soviets and what their strengths are. There we go. Warsaw Pact is on your right. Our measly defense is on the left. How many divisions did the Soviet Union does the Soviet Union have? I'm going to shock you. Actually going to be a triple shock. When the Joint Staff did an assessment of the Soviet military in 1946, they determined that the Soviets had 175 divisions. 140 of them were active, and they could mobilize 400 divisions in 30 days. All right, so 400 divisions against 25 divisions. It's not very good odds. The problem is, it's deceptive. You only had 60 divisions that are actually full strength. 58 of them were partial strength, maybe 50%, maybe 25%. And 57 were cadres, which meant they really had no strength in them at all. They were just paper divisions. So within Europe itself, you have 30 Soviet divisions that are in Eastern Europe. And you had 12 divisions that were in the strategic reserve in Western Russia. Now, there's some speculation as to what the strength of these divisions were, or whether they really existed or not. So they weren't really sure. But we know they have 30 divisions. So, counting those divisions, the Soviets only have 24 to 43 divisions that are available for a surprise invasion of Europe. The Joint Staff estimates were wrong. Why? Well, they equated occupation forces, Soviet occupation forces in Europe, with line divisions. Therefore, if you have occupation troops that are a division, we count it as a line division. Well, it's not a line division. It's not combat-ready division. It's just a bunch of soldiers that are occupying cafes and bars. But the Joint Staff never revises this. So when they're doing their planning of Soviet invasion scenarios, it's always 175 divisions careening across the northern German plains, through the Turingenwald, down into France, and taking over Europe within a month or so. And I'm not exaggerating. Within a month or so, that was the estimate. There's some things we need to really look at. In 1948, the manpower in the line divisions of the Soviet Union were about 700,000, 800,000 men. That's the maximum amount of fighters they could get in. 1948 NATO, you had about 800,000. 800,000, 800,000. A Soviet division is only about 9,000 to 12,000 men. A U.S. division is 16,000 to 18,000 men. So it's only, a Soviet division is only about 60% as large as an American division. What's more important is what's behind those divisions. The combat support and combat service support troops of an American division was about 40,000. Compare that to the Russians, 13,000 to 15,000. So our Corps have a big punch compared to their armies. What they called an army is our Corps. Our Corps are much larger than their armies. So these shock armies over here is very deceptive. They're going to have a hard time going across the NATO Corps. So what are the correlation of forces throughout the Cold War? Well, it's about 1.3 Soviet size to 1 NATO size. And, oh, by the way, the Soviets really can't count on the loyal support of their Warsaw Pact countries. Warsaw Pact comes into being in 1955 with Germany coming into the NATO. So they can't depend on their loyalty, especially Poland. The Poles don't like the Soviets being in their country. Go figure. So when they have to go through Poland, they'll probably have to drop off troops to secure the lines of communication. Really can't depend on Hungary because they dismantled their army during the Hungarian Revolution in '56. The only two countries they can really depend on are the Czechs and the East Germans, to give them any type of weight in an invasion. By the way, if you have to deploy a lot of reserve divisions from Russia into Eastern Germany, it's going to take you a lot longer than it looks like on the map because the road infrastructure, the railroad infrastructures are terrible. They have not rebuilt them. So it's going to take you a long time to be able to move those forces through those countries to get them onto the front line, I guarantee you we would have beat them to the punch with our naval transports. So why isn't this known publicly? I mean, my God, I was never told this when I was in NATO. No one ever told me this stuff. I thought these guys were a giant. I thought they were just going to roll over us. Well, if you're a European staff officer in the military, you don't really want to advertise that the Soviets aren't that big, that it's really a diminished threat. Because what's going to happen? The governments are going to cut their forces. They're going to make drastic cuts, particularly in defense spending. So that would mean that the alliance could crumble in itself because everyone says, the danger's not that big. Why have NATO? We won't even worry about it. What about from the U.S. side? Well, if we reach conventional parity with the Soviets, then that means we don't have to depend on the nuclear deterrent. The nuclear deterrence, that's a pretty cheap deterrent. So, Eisenhower was keenly sensitive to that fact, and so he never really wanted to advertise the fact that, hey, we're at least even with the Soviets, if not better, because that would mean the military would seek larger conventional forces as insurance. In the words of Buck Turgidson of Dr. Strangelove, Mr. President, we got the Soviets right where we want them. I said we twist the bayonet. And Eisenhower understands this. He understands the military. He should. He'd been in the military long enough. And he understood that mentality. So he keeps that pretty much under wraps. But he knows. Now, the Soviets are inferior. The Soviets know they're inferior. They do. They know that they're not as big as the Western newspapers are saying they are. And so they want to reach nuclear parity as well. Their interest in nuclear weapons are really to protect the state, not to play games with the Allies on whether we'll use our bomb if they have parity or not. It's really to protect themselves because they know how weak they are. Now, Eisenhower knows how weak they are. How does he know? U-2. U-2 reconnaissance planes. U-2 was making all these overflights over Russia, and it's verifying, hey, they don't have the missiles, they don't have the military forces that we thought they had. And so, but he can't say anything because U-2s are violating Soviet sovereignty. The Soviets aren't saying anything. They know what's going on, but if they say something, then that means they have to divulge that they know these flights are occurring and they can't shoot them down. And they're also deadly afraid that Eisenhower will say, okay, well, since you know, or since you're divulging that you know about these flights, we're just going to let everyone know that you guys are really weak. And they don't want that. And so it's really ironic when you have the shoot down of the U-2 plane of Gary Powers in May of 1960, why Khrushchev made such a big deal out of it. And it really befuddled Eisenhower. He's like, this guy really is crazy or stupid. And so I think that Khrushchev lost a great opportunity to keep his mouth shut, and he didn't do it because it would have been better off for both East and West. Now, because you are so weak and you know it, imagine how frightened you are when President Reagan comes along and starts having a very confrontational policy against you. This really frightened the Soviet leadership. There are war scares going on within the Kremlin from 83 and 84 specifically. And it's exacerbated by the deaths of Brezhnev, the premier, 1982, followed by Andropov in 84, followed by Chernenko in 85. They don't have a stable executive to be able to guide them through this period of turmoil. It's not until Gorbachev comes along that things start settling down, and we have a significant easing of the confrontation. It's really more or less through Gorbachev's personality and his willing to to meet with Reagan and discuss some of these issues. So in 1987, we have the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which is really the elimination of intermediate range and shorter range missiles. You know, the Pershing IIs, all their SS-20s, they can only affect Europe itself. They can't go across against the United States. Also in 1990, we have the Conventional Armed Forces in Europe, the CFE Treaty. So that creates NATO and Warsaw Pact force ceilings. That's also to the Soviets' advantage because they know they can't match us. Therefore, if they can keep us down, they're very happy. It's not an issue about who's going to invade who at this point. It's just keeping the status quo. Now, there's a couple other things that Gorbachev has unleashed in the process. All right, which, as the title suggests, Gorbachev had two dual policies: glasnost, which is greater freedom for the people, and perestroika, which is economic and social reforms. And these are great reforms, but they're too late to save the empire. No one behind the Iron Curtain had any faith in Soviet socialism at this point. And as you recall from the Cold War about how dire things are as a Eastern European or a Soviet citizen, you wouldn't have any faith in them either. So really, the containment strategy proved pretty sound. It's not that we did anything against the Soviet Union, it's that the contradictions in their system bore fruit and it collapsed on its own. And the implosion was pretty quick. November 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. And in the months following, you have a quick succession of Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria also taking place. You had the unification of Germany in October of 1990. The German problem is now resolved in a lot of ways. And it is the main instigator of the Cold War in many, many ways. Now, who's in favor of unification of Germany in Europe? Well, the Germans. And the United States. Those are the only two. Margaret Thatcher didn't want it. Mitterrand in France didn't want it. Everyone's deadly afraid of Germany still. Memories are long. So, with everyone not trusting the Germans, because they do have a history of militarization, the solution was we keep them under NATO. If you keep Germany subordinated to NATO, their military, they're not going to represent a threat. Remember the annual review. Everyone knows what Germany's doing. So if Germany decides it's going to remilitarize, everyone will know immediately, and they'll be able to take action. But as long as you're under NATO, it's not going to be a problem. And then another disaster occurs for the NATO alliance, another crisis. The Soviet Union dissolves in December 1991. And so now the raison d'etre for NATO is gone. I mean, that's why it was built, was against the Soviets. With the Soviets gone, why do we need NATO? Why didn't it dissolve? Well, part of it is because a new set of problems occurred with the dissolution of the Soviet Empire and the Warsaw Pact. And that's how to prevent wars from breaking out among all these new East European countries. Is that working? There we go. All these Eastern European countries might break out into war. Once the authoritarian lid was lifted, the old animosities were certain to resurface. And with that, you'd have a lot of brushfire wars breaking out. That was the fear. I mean, it certainly happened in the past. Why won't it happen now? So, what do we do? Well, what we do is NATO is reborn, and it has a new mission. Sure, it keeps the old collective security tasks, consultation, deterrence, stuff like that, but also has new missions: partnership, conflict prevention, crisis management, and these are all part of its new responsibilities. Now, what is partnership? Well, it stresses transparency. It's a confidence-building measure, and it's greater dialogue among and cooperation among allies. It's also conflict prevention and crisis management. So you're seeing that NATO is no longer a collective defense, it's now assuming collective security tasks with all of its implications. Afghanistan today is really a collective security task in a lot of ways. It's not collective defense. Now it also expanded ways to increase the dialogue and cooperation with other countries. So you have the Partnership for Peace, which is instituted in 1994. Those are your orange and yellow countries there. They all became part of Partnership for Peace. What was it? Well, it created trust between NATO countries and other states in Europe from the former Soviet Union. It has 22 members today. And it's also a key consideration for NATO's Membership Action Plan, which is what we're going to talk about next. What is the Membership Action Plan? Well, it's a way to get new countries involved in NATO, to join NATO, without assuming all the baggage that they have or had. So it's a program of advice and assistance and practical support, and it's tailored to the needs of each of these countries if they wish to join the alliance. Now, it's a lot harder to join the alliance after the fall of the Berlin Wall than it is prior. I mean, everyone was allowed in before, but now you really have to work for it to get into NATO. And it also becomes the key to NATO enlargement as a result. So let's talk a little bit about NATO enlargement. Really, what was it? As I said, you want to get these countries that are in danger of brush fire wars. If you get them into the fold, they're not going to start warring with each other. Because part of the Membership Action Plan was you had to subordinate the militaries to civilian control. You had to really downsize your militaries. If you had any border disputes with your neighbors, you had to eliminate that. You had to find some way to resolve those. And then we'll think about having you join NATO. And it's still an involved process as a result. And it's not just extending security and stability and partnership to these other countries. It's also spreading democratic values to them as well. A lot of these Eastern European countries had not really been exposed to liberal democratic ideals that really come as a result of the end of World War II. So you have the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, who joined in 1999. You have in 2004, the Big Seven: Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia. Now, what does that do if you're a Russian? I mean, NATO expansion to us is, you're spreading love and teddy bears and lollipops. To the Russians that have been invaded numerous times in their history, it's like, these guys are getting a little close to us. We don't like that. So, when you start talking to countries like the Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia about joining NATO, that's a little bridge too far for them. So you have a little thing in 2008 or 2009 where the Russians invade Georgia. 2008, thank you. That was over a little dispute over East Ossetia, blah, blah, blah. But it's really a signal to the West, don't try it, all right? Don't try it in Georgia. Don't try it in the Ukraine. NATO expansion is not going to go further east. And so far, they're right. We're not going to push the issue. We had two more countries that joined NATO. That's Albania and Croatia in March 2009. You have a couple others that are kind of looking at it. Kosovo, probably not a big chance right now. Macedonia, although one of the original members of the Membership Action Plan, not a very good chance right now because Greece is going to fight them. It's over their name, Macedonia, which is also a province in Greece. They don't want them to have aspirations towards taking that province away from them, so it becomes a big issue. So until that's resolved, Macedonia probably won't be part of NATO. Now, you also have other councils. You have the NATO Russian Council, This is greater dialogue between NATO and Russia. You have the Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council. That's got 50 members. That's really NATO and your PFP countries that establish a greater dialogue with one another. Oh, but it doesn't stop there. If you order now, you get NATO global affiliations. Not only do we have PFP and membership action plans, but you got the Mediterranean dialogue. That was established in 1994. All those countries in orange, Mauritania, Morocco, Algeria, Egypt, looks like Jordan's in there, and Israel. What's that doing? Well, it's outreach and cooperation with these countries to help them reach stability, security and stability within their own countries. I should say foster, not reach, foster it. You also have the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative of 2004. It's really the same thing, same concept, but it only really affects Kuwait, UAE, Oman. I think that's those countries there. Not Saudi Arabia, though, not yet. But it is an outreach. Okay. And I'm ready for questions and answers now. Before we go into Q&A, just let me do my last slide. I promise it'll only take 5 minutes, because it's really the heart of the lecture today. And I'm answering the question, why does NATO flourish today? Well, it did a number of things. One is it resolved the security dilemma of Europe. And what is the security dilemma? Well, the security dilemma is state A sees that it's in danger of aggression by its neighbors. So it decides it's going to build up its military forces. Makes sense. All the neighbors surrounding that nation say, hey, that country's building up its military forces. They, in turn, build up their military forces. State A sees the buildup of military forces and redoubles its efforts. So you get this spiraling up of countries that are building up their militaries overly large. So what that does is it creates a behavior of arms races, non-transparency among the countries and their militaries, and exorbitant fear of your neighbors. It also resulted in a lot of frequent wars in order to create a balance of power. So if you hear the balance of power of Europe, that's what's going on there. So a lot of these wars are really pressure releases up until World War I that changes the whole dynamic of that system. Number two, your pre-1939 alliances were often secretive. They were predatory in nature, meaning the alliance members would divide up the spoils of the victim countries. They were short-lived. They may last the duration of the war. They may not. They were very mercurial, because today's allies could be tomorrow's enemies and vice versa. So whether you were in an alliance or not, you didn't trust one another. So allies fought separately. They didn't coordinate their actions. The prevalent state behavior was to limit, obstruct, or thwart the military objectives of your own allies out of fear that they would become too powerful. So you have betrayal of allies as the norm. Number three, Germany, the most populous, wealthiest, industrialized state, is no longer a source of fear with the European powers. Its military is subordinated to NATO, and that in itself is reason to have NATO in its place. Because as a German staff officer once said, we cannot even trust ourselves, we need NATO. Another thing is, and this is quite unintended, I think, with NATO itself, is shared values. Civil liberties, fundamental human rights have proven to be very strong bonding forces for alliance members. Europeans remember Nazi rule, and they also, particularly the East Europeans, they remember Soviet communism and the threat that it portrayed. Number five, institutions. NATO is now an institution, and by their very nature, institutions endure. It's very difficult for an institution to kind of go away. They really don't. And it's also very difficult for a member of an institution to leave. They just won't do it. because of the normative values involved. Number 6, there's an added benefit of an integrated military. It's really easy to form coalitions. It's easy to implement missions quickly. It's with a lot less friction than in the past. Interoperability, meaning you have similar ammunition, some of the equipment is similar or shared, command and control, decision-making processes, SOPs, all that stuff is shared. So if I'm an American officer and I meet with even a Swedish counterpart, I know that he understands the 5-paragraph operations order. And a lot of his equipment and stuff is something I could figure out and operate with. So if we ever needed to do joint missions together, we could work it out rather quickly. These are big pluses in any type of arrangement. Thus, NATO has evolved from a purely defensive alliance into an alliance or an institution of liberal democratic values. These are all the crises that portended the end of NATO. None of them happened. If you ever want to talk about any of these during Q&A, I'll be happy. And that completes my lecture. Thank you. So let's get to that Q&A. Who do we got first? If you don't ask me a question, I will ask you questions. It'll be very painful. Yes, sir.
Going forward, I'm just wondering about the U.S. and their involvement with NATO, facing sequestration and budget issues and things that we can't economically commit to militarily. What's our situation with NATO in that regard?
Well, NATO's going to endure as long as the United States remains involved in it. Now, if the United States at one point says, you know, we've had it with NATO, we're going to withdraw completely, then I see NATO crumbling. It's not to our interest. Now, we may not be involved in the integrated military structure, per se, but that doesn't mean we're not part of NATO. Because it is an institution, we will continue to have dialogue with the Europeans. We'll have exercises with them should a humanitarian crisis occur or disaster response, and we need to have a coalition of the willing. For that, it doesn't always have to be a military response. We can certainly have these coalition building conferences with them. And so I see no change in that regard, because it's a value to everyone. And don't forget, liberal democracies love collective defense because it's cheap, and you don't have to put a whole lot of money into it.
Sir, on that theme of America not being part of perhaps the military, part of the alliance or whatever you said. Is that
military structure.
Military structure, sorry. Yeah. I tend to think that the Europeans, this is just based on nothing but my own crazy, musings. I tend to think the Europeans in maybe 2 decades or so will be more interested in having a similar alliance, but cutting the United States out of it. Because with the pivot to Asia and everything, I think their fears might be rising that we're going to get sucked into America's wars again and again and again. And so what is your sense of that? I mean, do you see any signals in, shifts in thinking in Europe that might lead them down that path? They still have the structure they've got now, except without the United States, and of course without Turkey, probably.
Right. Well, they got a thing called the Common Security and Defense Policy. It used to be called ESDP a long time ago. Before that, it was called the Western European Union. The problem is that there is no military structure per se. They can write strategies and stuff, and you can even have forces like the ARC. Let's get to the ARC. Boom, boom, boom. There's the ARC. Great as if it's part of NATO, but outside of NATO, it doesn't really work. The Western European Union attempted to go into operations in Bosnia and Albania in the 90s. It failed miserably. That's why NATO was brought in. So the Europeans know that, hey, by ourselves, without this structure over us to assist us, it's probably not going to be very viable. And for them to say, yeah, we don't really want the Americans involved in the future, I don't see it. Yes, there is the fear of them being dragged into a war, but remember Chapter 5? Respond in the way that you want to. The Europeans don't have to commit military forces to any type of operation that we deploy to. And in fact, if you look at Afghanistan, their biggest out-of-country deployment, their contributions are pretty small in a lot of ways. So, I mean, we really bear the brunt, the lion's share of that effort. And so as a result, even though you have something like this command structure here with all your forces that are involved, and you have your all the allies involved in it, they don't necessarily have to contribute the forces to a specific type of operation if they don't want to. They can kind of opt out. What the Germans like to do is say, hey, we're not going to provide troops, but we'll provide lots of logistical support and money. And so that's how the Germans like to operate. The Japanese are about the same way. The Japanese will say, we don't, we can't contribute troops, but we got this nice hospital here that will contribute. So, and that's probably one of the good things of the alliance, is that people can contribute things that the United States doesn't want to put a lot of effort into, hospitals and things like that. And it does help the overall effort. Does that answer your question? Pretty much so? Okay. Well, let me put it another way. Alliance members argue a lot. In fact, all these crises that I put up, you had a lot of arguments going on over each one of these. And each one of these were predicting the end of and the demise of NATO. Simply because you argue and you disagree fundamentally on things doesn't mean that it's enough to say, I'm going to leave the alliance. I've had it. Because no one has done it yet. And if they can survive these crises, I think they could pretty much survive most of them. As long as NATO provides things for all the members, then it will endure. That's my opinion. Anyone else?
Could you comment on the impact of the recent French intervention in Mali and the connection with the United States or with NATO, as it were?
Well, the French are providing the ground forces. Germany is providing logistical support, and so is the United States. And everyone's happy with that arrangement. Mauritania was a former French colony, so of course they get first dibs on that. And so they're going to go in. We're very happy, because politically, it's a very small footprint for the United States, and it's a big one for the French. A little bit about decolonization. Simply because the European countries left their former colonies did not mean that they cut off relations. They have very strong relations with their former colonies. Very close, I think, as well. And so when you see France becoming very interested in Congo, Zaire, any of those, it's probably because they just don't have the heart to cut them off completely. And so these countries will call back to the mother country for a little assistance when they need it. I think it's more psychological than anything. Anyone else?
Right here.
And I'll get you next after. Go ahead, sir.
I'd like your comments on the following statement. The one reason why NATO will probably never go away is that NATO provides a mechanism for the Western allied nations to project power without having to depend on the United Nations. Your comments?
Well, the United Nations was to resolve small issues. And in its inception, the unspoken idea was that the United States or the great powers would provide the muscle. UN would not provide the muscle. They would provide the peacekeeping forces, the dialogue and things like that in the aftermath or the run-up to that crisis or what have you, brushfire war. Yes, NATO does have the ability to provide muscle, but it also provides a lot of soft power, all right, or smart power is the word today. A lot of the values, when we go to another country, they always bring those also with them. And it's not just talk, it's also the actions of the alliance members when they come to a country. If they're well behaved, and for the most part they are, then that rubs off on the people. They go, wow, you know what a great country. I wish I were kind of part of that. Or I'm more interested in these types of values that they're projecting. So particularly in Iraq, even though that was a contentious war, but also Afghanistan and all the other countries that the NATO was involved in, it does rub off on them, I think. Does that answer your question, or do you want me to go into more detail? Is that good? That's okay. All right. I didn't answer the question, I guess, but you can talk to me afterwards. We can talk it more. Yes, sir.
Has there been any NATO discussion on the Israel-Palestine situation?
That's unsolvable. It's unsolvable.
There is a discussion.
And I'll go into the history of it a little bit. Eisenhower probably devoted 2 years to trying to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict. He knew from the very beginning, once Egypt once the regime was overthrown and Nasser came into power and stuff, he determined that the only way we're going to resolve this is for the Egyptians and the Israelis to come to terms, and then hopefully everybody else will follow. He couldn't get Nasser to agree to it. He tried everything. The Aswan Dam, tried all sorts of incentives. Nasser wasn't interested in it. And you had the Eisenhower Doctrine that was going to provide assistance to any country that's a victim of aggression through international communism, but he applies it in Lebanon so that the communist element or factor doesn't factor in, and so he intervenes anyway. The only way, and this is just my opinion, it's not the opinion of anybody else, I think the only way you're going to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict is by having a enforcement force occupy Israel and the Palestinian lands, like we did in Bosnia, like we did in Kosovo. Is that going to happen? No, it's not. It's politically unviable. But that's the only way you're going to get them to stop fighting, because they hate each other. Maybe some century down the road they'll be able to resolve it. But remember, France and Germany fought over Alsace-Lorraine for centuries, and that was an area of contention between the two countries, resolved by NATO, which maybe it doesn't have to be enforcement, maybe it can be a way of bringing them both into NATO or something like that. I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. I'm smart, but not that smart. Yes, sir.
My name is Maksat. I am from Kyrgyzstan, Central Asia, and I'm also from former Soviet Union. I have a question. It's not a question, just can you comment on what I say? I will say. First, I think NATO is important for international order. Also, I think security of Europe. I think all European great powers have nuclear weapons. Great Britain, France, Russia. The only country that doesn't have, I think, it's Germany, right? So I think if NATO dissolves, I think Germany would like to have one. Nuclear weapons.
Yeah,
let me finish it. First one. Second, a few years ago, U.S. installed air defense radars in Czech Republic and Poland. And I think Russians are not buying that U.S. installed them to protect missiles coming from Iran. They think that they feel they're threatened. Can you comment on this?
Yeah, the missile defense in Czechoslovakia and Poland. Yeah, that's one of those politically contentious issues that makes so much sense. It's a rational argument, but it becomes a political hot potato, because and the Russians are going to exploit that, all right, to their own advantage. for a number of reasons. All right, everyone knows that missile defense is not going to be able to stop a Russian massive nuclear launch, right? It was only intended for 1 or 2 nuclear missiles to intercept. The Russians say, okay, you say that today, but what do you say tomorrow? Because they've always had lots of agreements with countries only to be betrayed. And so what the Russians will always say is, like they're playing chess, okay, because you say today you're not going to do something and you have an advantage over us, doesn't mean that that can't be turned against us in the future. That is a Russian mentality. And so the Russians aren't going to buy into something like missile defense because of that. Was it really important to the Europeans? I don't think, other than the Polish and the Czechs, who really bought into it, I don't think the rest of the Europeans really bought into missile defense. It was too much of a hassle. It brought into too much political pressure from the Russians and a break of relationships than it was worth. And oh, by the way, Europe depends on a lot of their energy resources from Russia. So when Russia starts turning off that energy spigot, which they have done a couple of times, the Europeans feel it. They're not happy about it, but that's the world they live in right now. In the future, it might change. But the Russians do use that energy lever to coerce the Europeans to fall in line.
Your understanding of Putin's feeling towards NATO at this point and his buildup of Russian sort of aggressive talk?
Well, first of all, Russia represents no future danger to Europe, right? They have a number of problems on their own. Their demographics are diminishing greatly. It's 135 million right now. We think by the next 20 years it'll be down to 85 million because people are dying quickly. The mortality rate on babies is quite high. So they have a lot of problems. Their big problems are going to be probably the Islamization of southern Russia, and that's probably where their focus is going to be. That's speculation. I don't know. But in order for Russia to become a threat to NATO, first of all, they have to reincorporate Ukraine and probably the Baltic states. White Russia, they're closely allied with them anyway. And then they have to go towards Poland. First of all, to go against the Baltic states, you're now going against Poland, or correction, against NATO, and that's going to be a red line right there. So I don't see them even wanting to attempt to aggress against Europe. It just doesn't make sense rationally, and they are a rational actor. Now, Putin doesn't like NATO. He doesn't like any type of organization that might become a threat to Russia, and that's why he wants to make sure that there's no expansion into the Ukraine or Georgia. That's a red line for them. We can establish partnership for peace with these guys, and kind of talk about membership action plans for them. But it's not going to happen as long as Putin is in power. You might have been able to gotten away with that with Yeltsin, but not Putin. Too strong. He thinks like a typical Soviet despot. Autocrat. That's a better word. Autocrat. Okay. A czar. Yes. Anyone else? No other questions? Yeah, it's close. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. If anyone wants to come up and talk to me one-on-one, that's great. I'd love to talk with you all.
We have a little gift, not real big, but little.
Thank you.
But we have something brand new this year, the gold coins. This is from the first region USAWC giving it to your teacher.
Oh, thank you. I am a coin collector, so we'll put this in my coin box. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.